At 02:17 a.m., somewhere in occupied Western Europe, a German sentry stepped out of a concrete guard hut and never came back. No gunshot, no shout, no alarm bell. At 02:19 a.m., another soldier followed him into the darkness and vanished the same way. When the relief patrol arrived at 040 a.m., they found two bodies collapsed only a few feet apart. Eyes open, weapons, still slung, safety switches untouched. There were no shell casings on the ground, no scorch marks on the walls, no bullet holes in the surrounding concrete, nothing that looked like a firefight. The report filed before dawn used a phrase that appeared again and again across occupied Europe in 1943, cause of death unknown, no enemy contact. By sunrise, officers were already whispering the same question. How do two armed men die in silence within minutes of each other without a single sound carrying through the night? This was not an isolated incident. By mid-1943, German security files across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands began stacking up with cases that made no sense. Guards killed at point-blank range. Collaborators found dead in locked rooms. Targets eliminated in stairwells, barns, and narrow alleys where even a suppressed pistol should have echoed. Yet witnesses heard nothing. Not a crack, not a pop. Not even the metallic clatter of a weapon hitting the ground. In several cases, soldiers standing less than 30 feet away reported complete silence. The killings were so clean that Gestapo investigators initially suspected heart failure, poison, or internal betrayal. Entire resistance networks were blamed. Civilians were arrested. Some were executed. And still the deaths continued quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. What the Germans did not know at 030 a.m., 040 a.m., or even 6 months later, was that these men were not being killed by luck or darkness or betrayal. They were being hunted by a weapon that had been deliberately engineered to erase the most dangerous thing on a battlefield: noise. Somewhere in Britain, far from the front lines, a group of engineers working under total secrecy had designed a pistol that did not behave like a pistol, did not sound like a pistol, and did not even look like one. It was ugly, crude, almost laughable at first glance. But in the hands of a single operative, it could end a life at arm's length without waking the man standing in the next room. By the time German counterintelligence realized what they were facing, more than 200 targets had already disappeared into the night, leaving behind no sound, no warning, and no proof that a weapon had ever been used at all. By early 1942, British intelligence had reached a brutal conclusion. In occupied Europe, noise was no longer a tactical problem. It was a death sentence. Every conventional weapon the Allies possessed, rifles, pistols, even early suppressor systems, still produced enough sound to travel through stone stairwells, across courtyards, down narrow streets. In cities built centuries before, electricity sound carried fast and far. A single shot at 0140 a.m. could trigger alarms within seconds, boots on cobblestone within minutes, mass arrests by dawn. Reports from SOE field agents were chillingly consistent. One gunshot often resulted in 10 civilians detained. 2 shots could mean public executions the next morning. In some districts of France and the Low Countries, German reprisals followed a fixed ratio. 1 dead German meant 10 hostages shot, sometimes more. This created an impossible equation. Resistance operations depended on eliminating guards, couriers, and informants quietly, but every existing weapon made noise that could not be erased. Even the best suppressed pistols of the early war still cracked above 120 decibels, louder than a slammed door in a silent building. In enclosed spaces that sound-bounced, amplified, betrayed the shooter instantly. British planners began to realize that the problem was not accuracy range or firepower. The problem was physics. Gunpowder exploding at supersonic pressure creates sound. Suppressors could tame it, but they could not eliminate it. And in 1942, elimination was the only acceptable outcome. This crisis was felt most acutely inside the Special Operations Executive, the organization tasked with running agents alone, unprotected, deep inside enemy territory. These were not soldiers fighting platoons. These were individuals operating at arm's length from the enemy in stairwells at 0210 a.m., in barns at 11:50 p.m., in kitchens where families slept behind thin walls. They needed a way to kill one man without alerting the next. They needed silence so complete that even suspicion would not follow. Field cables sent back to London began repeating the same phrase again and again. Any audible discharge compromises the mission. By mid-1942, SOE leadership admitted that standard weapons doctrine no longer applied. A weapon that killed but revealed itself was worse than useless. It endangered entire networks. It burned safe houses. It erased months of work in a single echo. The Germans, meanwhile, had built their occupation around sound. Alarms, whistles, boots, barking dogs shouted commands. Control depended on being heard. British planners saw the opening immediately. If sound equaled power, then silence could become a weapon. Not reduced sound, not masked sound, no sound, at all. This was the strategic gap no one had solved. Not the Americans, not the Soviets, not even the Germans themselves. A pistol that could fire at close range without triggering alarms, without alerting adjacent rooms, without leaving acoustic evidence. It sounded impossible. It violated everything soldiers thought they knew about firearms. But without it, clandestine warfare in Europe was collapsing under its own noise. By late 1942, the directive coming out of London was clear, short, and desperate. Build a weapon where silence is not a feature, but the entire purpose. The solution did not come from a battlefield, a firing range, or a decorated war hero. It came from a place that officially did not exist. Hidden behind an ordinary fence line north of London sat Station 9, a secret research facility run by the Special Operations Executive. No unit patches, no public records, no victories announced. Inside, the people designing Britain's strangest weapons were not frontline soldiers. They were engineers, chemists, toolmakers, men who thought in tolerances and pressure curves, not medals and maneuvers. At the center of this effort was Major Millis Jeffers, a man whose wartime reputation was built not on combat, but on asking uncomfortable questions. While others tried to make pistols quieter, Jeffers asked why they needed to sound like pistols at all. He studied field reports arriving in London. At all hours, cables stamped with times like 01:55 a.m. and 04:30 a.m., describing missions ruined by a single echo in a stairwell or a courtyard. One report described a guard killed successfully, followed by 23 civilians arrested before sunrise. Another detailed a perfect ambush that collapsed because a suppressed shot was still heard through two walls. Jeffers understood something most commanders did not. The problem was not training. It was design philosophy. Firearms had always been built around power, first control second, and noise accepted as unavoidable. For clandestine warfare, that logic was backwards. At Station 9, Jeffers assembled a small team and issued a directive that shocked even experienced engineers. Forget elegance, forget rate of fire, forget appearance. Design a tool that exists for one purpose only: kill a man at close range without anyone else knowing it happened. If the weapon was ugly, that was acceptable. If it only fired a handful of rounds before parts needed replacing, that was acceptable. If it looked more like plumbing equipment than a military sidearm, even better. Around late 1942, prototypes began appearing on workbenches that barely resembled guns, tubes, bolts, rubber components that degraded after repeated use. Every unnecessary moving part was removed. Every metallic sound was scrutinized. Springs were dampened. Surfaces were roughened to prevent clicks. The team tested devices late at night, listening not just for noise, but for vibration traveling through floors and walls. A weapon could not simply be quiet at the muzzle. It had to disappear acoustically. During one early test, a prototype was fired inside a closed room, while another engineer stood less than 30 feet away, separated by a single wall. He heard nothing. No crack, no mechanical clack. Just a dull, almost embarrassing thud easily mistaken for a hand closing a drawer. That moment changed everything. By early 1943, Station 9 had something no other nation possessed: a pistol that was not trying to be silent, as a secondary feature, but had been designed from the ground up to make sound irrelevant. The men building it understood they were creating a weapon that would never be celebrated publicly. There would be no parade, no newspaper photograph. Most users would never even know who built it. That anonymity was not a flaw, it was the point. What emerged from Station 9 did not behave like a normal firearm because it was never meant to. Every traditional pistol of the era shared the same enemies, expanding gas, supersonic shock, and moving metal. When a cartridge ignites pressure spikes, violently gases rush forward, and the bullet often breaks the sound barrier, creating a sharp crack that no suppressor can fully erase. The engineers at Station 9 attacked each problem separately, then stripped the weapon down until only what was absolutely necessary remained. The result was a pistol that abandoned speed fire rate and aesthetics in exchange for something far more valuable: control over sound. The weapon fired subsonic ammunition by design, keeping the bullet below the speed of sound, so there was no ballistic crack at all. That alone removed one of the loudest components of a gunshot. But the real breakthrough came from how the expanding gases were handled. Instead of allowing pressure to escape violently at the muzzle, the pistol forced it through a long internal suppressor packed with rubber wipes. These wipes did not simply deflect gas. They trapped it, slowed it, and bled it off, gradually turning an explosion into a controlled release. After several shots, the rubber degraded and had to be replaced, but that limitation was accepted from the start. This weapon was never intended to fire dozens of rounds. It was built to fire a few in total silence and then disappear. Mechanically, the pistol rejected semi-automatic operation entirely. No slide cycling back, no metallic snap, no clatter of ejected brass. Instead, it used a manual bolt action, one round at a time. The shooter rotated and pulled the bolt deliberately, eliminating the chain reaction of noise created by moving parts. Even the trigger was simplified to reduce internal clicks. Every surface inside the weapon was treated as a potential sound source. Springs were dampened. Tolerances were adjusted so parts did not ring or vibrate. The grip itself doubled as an internal storage compartment, hollow, by necessity, further reducing weight and resonance. To an untrained eye, the finished pistol looked crude, almost unfinished. To an operative, it felt unsettlingly quiet. During testing, engineers measured sound, not in gunfire terms, but in everyday comparisons. A typical suppressed pistol of the early war still produced noise comparable to a slammed door. This weapon produced something closer to a hand closing a book. In some environments, it was quieter than footsteps on wooden floors. In enclosed spaces where sound normally amplified, it became even more deceptive. Shots blended into background noise, a cough, a chair shifting, a distant train. The designers had succeeded in something radical. They did not eliminate sound entirely. They reduced it below the threshold where the human brain recognizes danger. That distinction mattered. Soldiers react to sharp, sudden noises. They investigate gunshots. They ignore ambiguous sounds. This pistol exploited that psychology perfectly. Even its limitations were intentional. The effective range was short only a few yards. Accuracy beyond that was irrelevant. Missions involving this weapon were planned around proximity, darkness, and surprise. One man, one target, one silent outcome. The pistol was never issued widely. It was distributed selectively to agents trained to understand its fragility and its power. Each component reflected the same philosophy. If noise reveals you, then silence protects you. By turning physics and psychology into allies, this unassuming tool achieved something that no amount of firepower ever could. It allowed violence to happen without being noticed, and in occupied Europe, that was the most dangerous capability of all. The first time the weapon left Britain, it did so quietly sealed inside an unmarked case, handed to a courier who never learned its real name. By 11:30 p.m., it was already moving through occupied territory, passed from safe house to safe house. Never fired, never tested, never acknowledged. Orders were clear. Do not experiment. Do not practice. Use it only when the moment cannot fail. The first documented operation came weeks later. shortly after 0120 a.m. in a narrow stone building where a single German guard controlled access to a resistance radio room. The agent waited until the man turned his back. Distance measured in feet, not yards, 1 shot. The body collapsed forward. The sound did not carry beyond the room. No one upstairs stirred. At 0123 a.m., the radio transmission resumed. London received the message at 0140 a.m. Operation continued without interruption. That report triggered something rare inside SOE. Relief. Within days, similar field cables began arriving, stamped with times like 025 a.m., 0310 a.m., 1150 p.m. Each described the same pattern: close contact, single discharge, no alarm, no pursuit. In one mission, an agent eliminated 2 guards in succession, separated by less than a minute. The second man never realized the first was dead. He heard nothing that suggested danger. Another report described a killing inside a barn while livestock slept less than 10 feet away. No reaction. In urban environments, the effect was even more pronounced. Shots fired in stairwells blended into the ambient noise of buildings settling pipes, shifting distant street traffic. German patrols arrived hours later, not minutes. Often they arrived confused, unsure if a crime had even occurred. The weapon's limitations became advantages. Because it required deliberate manual operation, agents slowed down. They waited. They committed fully before acting. There was no spraying of fire, no panic shooting. 1 target meant 1 decision. That discipline reduced mistakes. Early German counterintelligence reports noted something unsettling. Guards were being found dead in positions that suggested no resistance at all. Rifles still slung, hands relaxed. In several cases, safety mechanisms had never been disengaged. Investigators initially suspected poison or internal sabotage. The idea that a firearm had been used did not fit the evidence. No witnesses reported hearing anything resembling a gunshot, even when stationed within the same structure. By late 1943, resistance networks began requesting the weapon by description rather than name. A quiet pistol. The one that does not sound like a pistol. Distribution remained tightly controlled. It was never meant for widespread use. It was reserved for operations where silence determined survival. In one documented case, an agent waited more than 3 hours in total darkness for a guard's routine to align perfectly. At 04:10 a.m., the shot was fired. At 04:12 a.m., the body was hidden. At 04:20 a.m., the team passed through the checkpoint undetected. These early missions confirmed what Station 9 had hoped, but could not prove in a laboratory. In the real world, under stress exhaustion and fear, the weapon worked. It did not announce itself. It did not escalate situations. It ended them quietly and allowed everything else to continue as if nothing had happened. That was its true test. Not whether it could kill, but whether the night would remain undisturbed after it did. By early 1944, something subtle but dangerous was happening inside the German occupation forces. They were no longer reacting to attacks. They were reacting to absence. Reports began to note not firefights, but gaps. A guard failed to report in at 020 a.m. A patrol arrived at 0230 a.m. and found a body with no obvious cause. No shots heard, no struggle, no witnesses. In places like Paris, Brussels, and rural transit hubs across France, this pattern repeated often enough that it stopped being dismissed as coincidence. German security doctrine had been built around sound. Alarms triggered response. Gunfire drew reinforcements. Silence meant safety. That assumption collapsed. Orders were issued instructing guards to operate in pairs, then in groups of 3. The logic was simple. If one man went down, another would hear it, but the weapon did not create the sound they were expecting. In several documented cases, a second guard stood less than 20 feet away and heard nothing unusual. When he turned and saw his partner on the ground, the delay was already fatal. The psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers began reporting noises that were not there. Doors settling, wind through shutters, footsteps that vanished when investigated. Silence became suspicious. This eroded discipline faster than open combat ever could. Sleep deprivation followed. Guards rotated more frequently. Fatigue set in. Mistakes multiplied. German counterintelligence struggled to explain the phenomenon. Some units blamed resistance infiltration. Others suspected internal betrayal. Trust inside units weakened. Men watched each other more closely even as they failed to detect the real threat moving among them. In occupied cities, the weapon amplified fear rather than force. A single silent killing forced entire checkpoints to shut down for hours. Rail traffic halted while investigators searched for a non-existent shooter. Resources were diverted to noise detection, patrol density increased, and yet none of it addressed the core vulnerability. The enemy was not loud. He was invisible. Gestapo memos from late 1943 and early 1944 began using careful language. Phrases like unexplained neutralization and no audible contact appeared repeatedly. The absence of sound made reconstruction impossible. No witnesses meant no timelines. No timelines meant no suspects. Entire investigations collapsed before they began. The most damaging effect, however, was internal. German soldiers stopped trusting their environment. A quiet stairwell no longer felt safe. A closed room became a risk. Standing alone, even for minutes, felt dangerous. Some units shortened sentry shifts not to improve security but to preserve morale. This created predictable patterns that resistance agents quickly exploited. The weapon did not just remove individuals, it reshaped behavior. It forced the occupiers to defend against something they could not hear, could not see, and could not easily explain. By the time Allied forces landed in Western Europe, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. The occupiers were tense, exhausted, and overextended, reacting to shadows rather than threats. All of this stemmed from a tool that never announced itself. It never escalated violence. It simply introduced doubt into every quiet moment. In warfare, doubt spreads faster than bullets. And once silence became frightening, the balance of control began to shift. By the time Allied intelligence attempted to measure the impact, they ran into an unusual problem. There were almost no numbers to count. No firefights logged, no weapon recoveries, no ballistic reports. The very quality that made the weapon effective also erased its paper trail. Still fragments remained. SOE after action reports resistance diaries, German counterintelligence files captured after liberation. When analysts began stitching them together, a picture emerged that was both incomplete and unsettling. Between late 1942 and mid-1944, more than 200 confirmed enemy personnel were assessed as neutralized in circumstances matching the weapon's signature. Close range, no alarm, no witnesses, no follow-up pursuit. These were not frontline soldiers. They were guards, couriers, informants, liaison officers, men whose removal created gaps far larger than their ranks suggested. In several regions of France and the Low Countries, entire intelligence chains collapsed after the quiet removal of just one or two individuals. Radio operators resumed transmissions without interruption. Sabotage teams moved through the checkpoints that should have stopped them. Rail lines were cut repeatedly because the men assigned to protect them simply did not return to their posts. The strategic value lay not in body counts, but in timing. A single silent kill at 02:30 a.m. could open a window that lasted until dawn. During that window, explosives were planted, documents were stolen, prisoners were moved, messages were sent to London. These actions rarely appeared connected in German reports because the initiating event left no audible signature. Analysts later noted a pattern. Operations following silent eliminations had a significantly higher success rate and dramatically lower civilian reprisal rates. In districts where noisy attacks had once triggered mass arrests, resistance activity suddenly spiked without corresponding crackdowns. That shift alone saved lives. The weapon's influence extended beyond Europe. Allied planners studying irregular warfare took note. The idea that small controlled violence could enable large strategic effects without escalation began shaping doctrine. Silence became a force multiplier. It allowed resistance movements to operate longer, deeper, and with less exposure. Even German resources were affected. Increased patrol density, shortened shifts, and constant investigations drained manpower from frontline duties. Security units spent nights searching for threats that left no trace while real operations unfolded elsewhere. One captured memo from early 1944 admitted the problem plainly. Enemy activity increases without acoustic indicators. That sentence revealed everything. The occupation relied on being able to hear danger. When danger stopped making noise, control fractured. The pistol itself did not win battles. It never appeared in victory reports. But it enabled hundreds of missions that would otherwise have failed. It allowed individuals to reshape events far beyond their physical reach. In a war dominated by tanks, bombers, and artillery, this small, crude device proved that strategic impact did not always scale with size or sound. Sometimes it scaled with absence, with moments where nothing was heard and everything changed. When the war ended, there were no ceremonies for the weapon that had thrived in silence. No press photos, no victory tallies, no official acknowledgement. While tanks rolled through liberated cities and aircraft filled the skies in celebration, this pistol was quietly locked away. Many units were destroyed on purpose. Others disappeared into classified storage, their existence omitted from public inventories. For years after 1945, even mentioning it in official documents required clearance. The reason was simple. The weapon had never been designed to be remembered. Its value depended on remaining unknown. Unlike rifles or machine guns, it had no place in peacetime arsenals. It was too specialized, too uncomfortable, too honest about what it was built to do. Yet its influence did not vanish. Inside special operations communities, the lessons endured. Silence as doctrine, precision over firepower, psychological disruption over spectacle. Modern suppressed weapons, clothes, quarter tools, and clandestine tactics all trace part of their lineage back to the same principle proven in occupied Europe. Eliminate noise, and you eliminate reaction. Even decades later, veterans who encountered the weapon spoke about it cautiously often without naming it. They described it as unsettling, not because it was powerful, but because of how easily it removed life without drawing attention. Museums eventually displayed a few surviving examples behind glass. Visitors often mistook them for crude prototypes or improvised devices. They missed the point entirely. This pistol was not crude. It was intentional. Every limitation was chosen. Every compromise was accepted. It represented a different kind of warfare, one where success was measured not by explosions, but by what failed to happen afterward. No alarms, no reprisals, no headlines. In the broader history of World War II, it remains overshadowed by louder inventions. Yet for those who operated in the dark, it was one of the most consequential tools ever created. It allowed individuals to bend events without revealing themselves. It protected resistance networks by keeping violence contained. It saved lives precisely because it ended others quietly. In the end, that is why its story feels incomplete. The absence of noise left an absence of records. But if you follow the pattern of quiet deaths, uninterrupted transmissions, and operations that succeeded where others failed, its presence becomes unmistakable. In a war defined by overwhelming sound, this weapon proved that silence could be just as decisive.